Hello, and welcome to this series on how to build an Angular 1 application in an Angular 2 style. Angular 2 introduced a lot of new approaches and ideas on how to write Angular applications, which quite frankly caught a lot of developers off guard. Angular 2 simply did not look like anything that Angular 1 developers were used to writing. With new tooling, syntax, and even a new language via TypeScript, a lot of us had to go back to the drawing board and learn Angular all over again. The upside is that the majority of these changes were architectural in nature, and the main pieces have been backported to Angular 1. My favorite part is how Angular 2 really brought component-driven development to the forefront of how we architect applications. It is the cornerstone for building large, non-trivial apps that are not only predictable, but scalable. This approach works really nicely in Angular 1.x with the introduction of module.component. In this series, we are going to revisit our old friend Egli, the trusty bookmark manager, and build it from the ground up using a component-driven approach. We are going to learn how to load modules and assets using Webpack. We'll see the basic structure of a component, how to build components using the new .component syntax, how to approximate inputs and outputs using isolated scope to create smart and dumb components, how to use component lifecycle hooks within our controllers and what that means. We'll also see how dependency injection works in ES6 and how to test components using the new component controller provided by Mox. Now I'm going to start at the 00-start branch and build our application from there. You can follow along, or if you want to jump to a specific lesson, then you can check out the corresponding lesson branch and you'll be immediately caught up to wherever we are. And you can see these branches here. And so by approaching our Angular 1 applications in an Angular 2 style, we immediately reap the benefits of best practices and a better architecture. But it also sets the stage for a streamlined upgrade in the future, which is a nice side effect indeed. In this lesson, we are going to learn how to set up Webpack to convert our code into something the browser can understand. For instance, we will be using ES6 in this series, and to do that safely, we need to convert our code into ES5 for the browser. We will also make heavy use of module loading, and so we need Webpack to help us locate and resolve all of our assets and, more importantly, their dependencies. So the first thing we need to do to enable Webpack in our project is to create a configuration file to tell Webpack how to run. So we'll hop in here and we're going to start to build out our configuration object. The first thing that we're going to define is what we want our output to actually be. In this case, we want it to be a file with the name of bundle.js. And from here, we're going to define how we're going to load our modules. So we'll define a module object, and from here, we're going to create an array of loaders. So we'll start with a really simple loader, and we're just going to test for HTML files. So this is just a regular expression that tests for this HTML pattern, and when it matches, it's going to apply this loader to it. So in this case, we're doing raw, which is a simple loader that just takes the raw content of the HTML file and puts it into the bundle. Now let's do another one. This is CSS. And this is a slightly more ambitious because we're going to actually stack two loaders together. Now this reads from right to left, and we're saying take the CSS, resolve it, and then add it as a style tag into our DOM. The next one we're going to do is stylus, which is the same thing, but we're adding an additional stylus loader on to the end of it. From here, we're going to just do a bit of an esoteric pattern here that's just going to grab all of our kind of external assets such as fonts, SVGs, etc., and we're just going to generate a URL for it. Now, for the grand finale, we're going to create our JavaScript loader. So we'll just set up a regular expression test for that to test for the JavaScript extension. And then from here, we're going to add one more property, and that's exclude, because we're going to exclude the node modules, which we do not need to process. And then we'll add in our loader, which is going to be ng-annotate to help with dependency injection, and Babel to convert ES6 to ES5. Let's add one more property on here to help with debugging, and that's devTool, and we're going to set this to emit source map when it handles the bundle. Now let's hop into our gulp file, and we're going to add Webpack into our build system. So we're going to import Webpack stream, and what this allows us to do is communicate with Webpack via streams, which is what gulp uses. Now let's create a new Webpack task, and we're going to return a new stream that's going to start at our entry point. So we'll go past .entry, and we'll take all of the files from that entry point, and we're going to pass them to Webpack with our Webpack configuration file we just created to be processed. And then we'll take the output of that, which is just a bundle.js file, and we're going to send that to our output. And now that we've created our Webpack task, let's go ahead and add this to our default gulp task. And since we're here, let's go ahead and add this to our watch task as well. And now that we've created our Webpack and hooked it into gulp, let's create a new JavaScript file to verify this is working. So we're going to create an app.js file in our app directory, and we're just going to put a simple console log here that says hello Egli ES6 exclamation point. And now let's go into our index.html file, and we need to actually include our bundle.js file. So we'll type bundle.js here so that our file gets included. And now let's kick things off with npm start, and let's hop into the browser. And when we reload this, we should look in the console and see hello Egli ES6. The reason being is, even though we didn't explicitly include bundle.js, it was wrapped up in Webpack. So let's do a quick review. We created Webpack config with our output, and then our loaders here. And our JavaScript loader specifically is using ng-annotate and Babel. And then we hooked this into gulp with Webpack stream. And then we created a Webpack task that starts at our entry point, passes that into Webpack, and then puts our output into our destination path. Then we added it to our default task and our watch task. We included bundle.js into our index.html. And then we had a console log in app.js just to prove that it was working. And this is how you add Webpack to a project. In this lesson, we are going to learn how to create our first root level component. In Angular 2, we no longer use ng-app to bootstrap our application, but rather kick off the bootstrap process by pointing it to a single top level component that all our other components will branch off of. We can simulate that pattern in Angular 1 by creating a single top-level component that lives within our index.html file that serves as the entry point to all of our other components. So to get started with our first app component, let's create some files. We're going to hop into the command line, and we'll jump into the app directory, and we're going to create our app.html, which is our template, app.style, which will hold our CSS, and then app.component.js, which is going to hold our component configuration object for app component. Now let's hop into app.html. I'm just going to paste some HTML in here so I don't have to type it, as well as let's hop into our style, app.style, and we'll paste in our styles here as well. Not important to the concept that we're covering. So let's hop into our app.component, and we're going to import our template from app.html. Then we will also import our styles via app.style. And then from here, let's go ahead and create our component configuration objects. So we're going to create an object called app component, and we could do template:template, but using the new ES6 object literal syntax, we can just put in template and ES6 will figure it out for us. From here, we're going to export this app component that we just created. And you'll notice that we have our template and our styles. This is similar to an Angular 2 where you actually attach your template and your styles directly to the component object. So now let's hop into our app.js and we're going to import a few utility files. So Bootstrap CSS only, normalize.css, and now let's import Angular from Angular so that we can create our module. And then we'll also import app component from app component that we're going to use to define our components. So angular.module will create our app module, no dependencies, and .component. And we're going to create our component app, which is really our selector, and then we'll pass it in the app component configuration object. Then from here, let's hop onto our body tag, and we're going to go ng-app equals app. So we're going to bootstrap to the app module. And then we're going to do ng-strict-di, which just forces us to use dependency injection safe syntax, and ng-cloak, just to make things a bit smoother. And then let's delete this tag right here. We're going to go app. So this creates the app component or initializes it into our application. Now let's go npm start to see this in action. And so Webpack is compiling, then looks like we're good. Let's hop into the browser, refresh, and now you can see we have our categories column and our bookmarks column that's being picked up by our app component that we put into our index.html. And so just to review, we created our app module, which then we attached our app component to. That contains our app.html template as well as our styling. And then within our component, we are importing those and then attaching our template to our app component configuration object. And then from there, once we've exported that, then we will hop into our index.html, and you can see that we're adding that to the page using the app element, which then renders like this in the page. And so this is how you create your first top-level root component. In this lesson, we are going to dig into components a bit more by creating a subcomponent and hooking it into our root component. Let's start with the organization and structure of components in an Angular 2 style. It is considered best practice to organize your components by feature. For example, we want to create a categories component. So the first thing that we're going to do is create a components directory to put all of our components. From within that, we're going to create a categories directory to put all of our category specific files in. And then within our categories directory, we need to create a top level file that will serve as an Angular module for our feature. So in this case, we're going to call it categories.js. So let's hop into the categories directory, and we'll go ahead and just create this file. Now, an Angular 2 module generally contains an ES6 class that serves as the controller, a template, and additional styles. So let's go ahead and create the template. We'll create the stylus file for our styles, and we'll create categories.component.js to hold our component configuration. Now let's hop into our categories template, just paste some HTML in here. Let's go to our stylus file, paste our CSS into that, and then let's hop into categories.component.js, and we're going to import the template as well as the additional styles. Now, make note that we're using // to indicate that we want to resolve the module in our current directory and not in the node modules directory. Now let's go ahead and start to build out the component configuration object. So this is incredibly simple. We're just passing in the template. So this is the most simple component that you can have. Let's go ahead and export this. And then now let's hop into categories.js and let's define our Angular module to attach our component to. So we'll import Angular, then we'll import the categories component. And then let's go ahead and define our component object. So we'll go angular.module, and we'll just call this categories. And it has no dependencies, and we're just going to use the .component syntax to create a new component. So we'll use the categories as the selector, and we'll pass in categories component. Now let's go ahead and export this. And now that we've created our categories component with the container module, we need to create one more container module for all of our components. So we'll go up a directory and we're going to create components.js. From here, import Angular from Angular, and we're going to import the categories module. This will be a dependency to our components module. So components module, and then angular.module, and we'll call this components. And it's going to have one dependency, which is going to be the categories module. So we'll go categories module.name. And then we'll go ahead and export this. So this is a lot of wiring up our small, fine-grained pieces within our application. Now let's hop into app.js and let's add our components module to our root component. So import components module from components/components. And then we'll go components module.name. So we'll hop into our HTML and we'll just update this to point to our categories element. Let's check the console, make sure that nothing is broken. So we'll hop into our browser. We'll just refresh this for fun, and you can see that our categories component is rendering. We'll just make this a bit smaller. And so let's just do a quick review of what we've done. We created a categories directory to put our categories feature. We created a categories module to hold all of our category specific stuff, including categories component, which just holds our template and our styles. From there, we created a components container that is defined as components module that we then wired up into our app component, and then we updated our app.html to have a reference to our categories component, which we can see here. And this is how you create a component in an Angular 2 style. In this lesson, we are going to learn how to create a controller for our Angular 2 style component. Up to this point, we have used our components to serve as a holding pen for our templates, but what happens when we need to do real work? Our component configuration object offers us quite a few additional options besides just setting the template. For instance, we can point it to a controller, set controller as, define isolated scope, etc. So for reference, let's look at an Angular 2 component real quick and compare where we are going. So using the component configuration object, we're essentially approximating the object that we send into this component metadata here. But now the class underneath serves as the component controller. And this is one of the main reasons we're using ES6 for this project, is because how close it resembles its Angular 2 counterpart. So let's see what I mean by creating a categories controller to see how close it resembles this Angular 2 component we just looked at. We're going to go ahead and create our categories.controller.js. And then we'll hop into that, and we're going to define an ES6 class, and we're going to call this categories controller. And then from here, we're going to define our constructor, and we're going to initialize a property called categories. Now we'll just hop into our data. We'll just pull the categories JSON out of here. Just copy this and paste it in. And then from here, we now have a categories controller class with a constructor that, when it gets initialized, will set this categories array with categories objects. Now we need to export this, so export default categories controller. And then let's hop into our categories component and make this available to our component. So we're going to import this, import controller from /categories controller, and then using the shorthand syntax that we did for template, we're going to go ahead and just set controller, but then we're also going to define controller as, and because this is going to be used to display list of categories, let's do categories list controller. And then now we need to hop into our categories template and update this. So we'll just delete these bottom items here, and then we're going to add ng repeat to this category item. So new line, ng repeat, and then we'll go category in categories list controller dot categories. And then we're going to bind to category.name. Let me just make sure that I did this correctly. And I did. Let's make sure that nothing is broken on the command line. Looking good. So let's hop into the browser and see if this is rendering. And here we go. So we have development, design, exercise, humor. And you can notice the similarity between the Angular 2 component and our Angular 1 controller using this ES6 class. And this is how you create and define a controller in an Angular 2 style component within your Angular 1 application. In this lesson, we are going to learn how to create services in an Angular 2 style. A recurring theme in Angular 2 is that everything is just a class. When we do our controllers in an Angular 2 style, they are also just a class. In Angular, we want to keep our controllers thin and very specific to the view it controls. To accomplish this, we are going to refactor our categories collection into a categories model. Because services are generally shared by the entire application, let's put our categories model into a common models folder. So we'll go common /models categories.model.js. And because we are working with just a class, that is the theme, let's copy the categories controller, paste it in, and we're just going to update it to say categories model and not categories controller. And so this is the only change that we're going to make. We're going to let ES6 do the work for us. And now that we have our categories model, we need to create a common module in which we can attach this to. So we'll create common.js, and we're going to import Angular from Angular. Then we'll also import our categories model from models /categories.model. And then we'll go ahead and define our module objects. So common module equals angular.module. We'll call this module common, no dependencies, and then we're going to define a service on the module, and we'll just call this categories model and pass in the categories model module that we just defined. And then from here, let's export this so that we can pick it up in our app.js. We'll go ahead and import this. So import common module from common /common. And then we'll go into our dependencies and add in common module.name. And now we just need to hook this into our controller. So dependency injection happens at the constructor level by passing it in as a parameter. So we'll pass in categories model, and then this .categories equals categories model.categories. Let's check the command line and make sure nothing is broke. But let's look in the browser, and you can see here that because we're in strict mode, something happened with our dependency injection annotation. We solve this by adding in ng-inject into our constructor, which then allows ng annotation to properly resolve our dependencies. And so now you can see that our categories are being pulled from the categories model. So we defined our common module, we attach categories model to it, which has our categories collection. And notice that it's just a class, very similar to an Angular 2 class. And then in our categories controller, we're passing that in to the constructor, and then we're able to consume it by saying this.categories equals categories model.categories. And this is how you create a service in an Angular 2 style within your Angular 1 application. In this lesson, we are going to talk about dependency injection in an Angular application using ES6. There is a gotcha that I want to point out that most people will run into, especially if they've not spent a lot of time using classical languages. I want to start by showing a contrived example, and then we will anchor it back into our application. I'm going to start by creating an add method that accepts a category parameter. Now within this method, we're not actually going to do anything because that is not important. But what we're going to do is create a second method called return category that we want to return the value of the category sent into the add method. Now, obviously this is not going to work because category is not available within the return category scope. So we can try to fix this by adding this dot category, and so now it's scoped to the categories model class, but then again, the category parameter itself, and this is important, is only scoped to the add method. And so what we have to do for this to work is go this dot category equals category and assign category to an instance member. So keeping that in mind, let's go ahead and delete that. And we're going to inject the queue service. And what we want to do is use the queue service outside of the constructor. And so how we do this is by assigning queue to a local member. So this dot queue equals queue. And then from there, we can create a get categories method that will return a promise that is resolved with this dot categories. So we'll go return this dot queue dot win, and then we'll go this dot categories. And so now we can see that within the get categories method, we are referencing the queue service as well as categories by scoping it to the class using the this keyword. Now let's hop into our categories controller and change this around so that we're calling the service and operating on the promise. So categories model.get categories, from there .then, and then we'll go result using a fat arrow, this dot categories equals result. And then we can hop into the browser. We can see that this is indeed working. The only difference is that now our controller is working with a promise and not accessing the categories service directly to get the categories, which in this case is totally fine. And then from here, the main point of this lesson is that we are injecting the queue service, but then we have to assign it to a local instance so that we can use it outside of the constructor. And so this is something to keep in mind when using dependency injection within an Angular 1 and even an Angular 2 application. In this lesson, we are going to learn how to use inputs and outputs to create smart and dumb components. In Angular 2, components communicate via the concept of inputs and outputs, which is very similar to isolated scope in Angular 1. Property data goes in and user events come out. This allows us to create components that are dumb in the sense that they contain no logic whatsoever, as their only function is to display data and relay user events back to its parent component. This reduces our testable surface area significantly because unless Angular has broken, there is really nothing to test. We can then use smart components to coordinate the layout of our dumb components, and then we pass user events back to the appropriate services. We're going to start by building out a categories item component. I've went ahead and put in the styles and the category item module. And so we're going to get started at the category item component. So the first thing we're going to do is import our template. And then we'll go ahead and import our styles. And then we will define our component configuration object. And before I forget, I'm going to export this. Then I'll do the template, controller as. Now, the interesting thing about components is that if you do not explicitly define a controller, it would just implicitly create one for you. Now, in Angular 1, we would define isolated scope by creating a scope object and then saying that we want to pass in a category and set that to two-way data binding. It then turned to bind to, and then it's now bindings. And so this would work, but we're going to change it to one-way data binding using this less than symbol, so it binds from the parent to the child, and change detection is only on the parent, not on the child. Now let's update our template. And then we're going to just bind to category item controller, category, this is what we're passing in, and then the name property on that object. Now let's go ahead and add in the category item module to our categories module so that we have connected the dots. And then we'll go ahead and add this as a dependency. And then from here, we need to update the categories.html to use our category item component. So we'll delete this class first, then we'll delete this, and then we'll go category item, and then we're going to define a category attribute and pass in our category object. Now let's hop into the browser, and you can see that it's working, but just to prove that it is, let's go ahead and update this template, and we'll just put 2 exclamation points in here. We'll hop back into the browser, and so you can see that we're rendering the category item component. And so now that we've created an input, let's go ahead and create an output. So let's hop back into our category item component, and we want to create an output of selected so that when an item is selected, then it emits an event that we can bind to. So that's just expression isolated scope. So we'll capture the ngClick event, and then from here we're going to call category item controller dot selected, because that is what we defined on our bindings object. Now this has to be an object map when you send parameters back. This is the one gotcha that gets me. So we're setting in a category object, and then we're passing in category item controller. And then within our categories.html, let's update this to capture the selected event, and then we're going to call an onCategorySelected method on our categories controller, and we'll just pass in the category. We'll go ahead and scope this to the categories list controller. And then we need to jump into our categories list controller and then define that. So we'll go to categories list controller, and we'll define this method on category selected, and we'll pass in the category. And then from here, we're just going to log this output to the command line. So we'll go category selected, and then we'll just dump the category object that we're passing in. So let's hop into the browser and see this working. So as we click a category item, you can see that it is being logged to the console. Now let's just do a quick review. So we created our category item component that has a category input and a selected output. And then from there, we are binding to the category input, and then on click, we're calling category item controller selected and passing in the category via an object map. And so that is our output. And then in our HTML, we're passing in category, and then we're binding to the selected output, which then in our categories item controller, we're capturing the selected event and then deferring that to onCategorySelected, which we were logging to the console. Now, one thing I want to point out is that you'll notice in the category items component, there is no controller. It's completely dumb. And so this is how you create smart and dumb components in Angular 1 in an Angular 2 style. In this lesson, we are going to learn about Angular lifecycle hooks and how we can use them in our application. A component has an internal lifecycle that is managed by Angular. And what I mean by that is Angular is responsible for not only creating the component, but rendering it, creating and rendering its children, checking when data-bound properties change, and determining what needs to be cleaned up when the component is removed from the DOM. Well, Angular offers us component lifecycle hooks that gives us visibility into these key moments so that we can hook into them and perform bits of logic. And so if we look at the documentation, we can see some of these hooks here. So ng on init, ng on destroy, ng on changes. And so these are the ones that we're going to use frequently in Angular 2, but you can see there's a pretty big list here. Now, the wonderful thing is that component lifecycle hooks have been ported back to Angular 1.5. And so we are going to see an example of how this works in an Angular 1 application. So in our app.html, we're going to create a button. We're going to give it a toggle label, and then from here on ng-click, we're going to toggle an isVisible property. And then we're going to add an ng-if to our categories component that's going to toggle visibility depending on the value of isVisible. So let's hop into the browser and see what this looks like. So we'll click toggle, you see it, click it again, you don't, see it, and you do not. And so this is a perfect candidate to hook lifecycle hooks into our categories component. So let's go into our categories controller, and we're going to add an onInit method and just a simple console log statement. But we'll also add an onDestroy method, and we'll do another console log so that this gets called when the element is removed from the DOM. Okay, so now that we've defined our lifecycle event hooks, let's open up the developer console, and as you can see, as we toggle this, we are getting our console logs shown to us. And so this is kind of an adorable example, but what is a practical use for lifecycle hooks? Well, one of the main reasons why we use this is because it's best practice to remove any initialization logic out of the constructor. So we're going to move this categories model, get categories call, into the onInit event hook, and then we're just going to reference this dot categories model equals categories model, and then also we need to reference this dot categories model within our onInit lifecycle hook. We'll clean up the DOM here, and now that this is cleaned up, let's hop into the browser, and you can see now that we were able to get the categories, but we did it from the onInit lifecycle hook. Now this is especially important when you have a component, a subcomponent that has a dependency on a parent component that has properties that may not exist because they're part of an asynchronous operation. This is why you want to move these to an onInit lifecycle hook. And so this is how you leverage event lifecycle hooks within an Angular 1 application. In Angular, we want to keep our controller small and focused on the view that it is controlling. We accomplish this by moving as much logic and state as we can into models. Angular 2 introduced observables and async pipes, which makes it really easy to manage state and communicate that directly to our templates. We can start to point our Angular 1 applications in that direction by binding to our models directly from within our controllers. In this lesson, we will see a simple example of this technique in a slightly more advanced case where we lose the lexical reference to the this keyword. We're also going to do a bit of review as we build out the bookmarks component for this example. I have created a bookmarks model, which you can see here, and I have added it to the common module. I've also started creating a bookmarks component and have added the styles in the HTML, which you can see here. In the HTML, we're just doing an ng repeat over the bookmarks collection, and here are the styles with the active style being the most important one. So we'll get started by jumping into the bookmarks controller. We're going to define our bookmarks controller class, and then we will define our constructor, and we're going to pass in the bookmarks model. We'll add in ng inject, And then from there, we will assign a local reference to the bookmarks model. And then in our onInit event hook, we're going to fetch the bookmarks from the bookmarks model. Then we will assign the results of that to this dot bookmarks. And from there, let's export this. And then we'll jump into our component and we'll hook this up. So import template. Then we'll import the controller. Then let's import the styles. And from there, let's define our component configuration object. So bookmarks component. And then we'll set the template, the controller, and controller as. We'll give it a property of, or value of bookmarks list controller. And then from there, let's export this. And then we will hop into our bookmarks module and we'll build this out. So import Angular from Angular. And then we will import the bookmarks component. And then we'll define our module. So bookmarks module equals angular.module. We'll give it a name of bookmarks, no dependencies, and then we'll add our component to it using .component, bookmarks as the selector, and we'll attach the bookmarks component object to that. We'll export the bookmarks module, and then from there, we'll hop into our components module, and we'll add this as a dependency so it is available for the rest of the application. Now that we've imported it, let's add it in as a dependency. And then from there, let's hop into app.html. We're going to replace this h1 tag with a bookmarks component. Now if we hop into the browser, we'll see not only categories, but we can see bookmarks on the right-hand side. Now the next step is we want to, when we click a category, we want to show only the bookmarks for that category. So how we're going to do that is we're going to first jump into the categories model, and we're going to create a mechanism to store the current category. So this .current category equals null, and then from there we're going to add a getter and a setter method so that we can get the current category, which will return this .current category. And then we'll create a setter method called setCurrentCategory that will accept a category parameter and then assign that to this .currentCategory. And then from there, let's hop into the categories controller. And we're going to update onCategorySelected to when a category item is selected. We're going to capture that category item and pass that into the categories model to store that value. Now we're also going to create another method called isCurrentCategory. We'll pass in a category item, and then we're just going to first check if there is a current category by calling this categories model get current category, and if there is, then we're going to compare the ID of the item returned by get current category to the category item that we passed in. So this is the first simple example of binding to a model, as we'll see when we hook in ngClass. So we're going to toggle on an active property, which we saw in the style sheet that we looked at earlier. And so from here, active is going to be applied when categories list controller.isCurrentCategory, And the category we pass in evaluates to true. We're also going to update the logo to capture an ng click. And from there, we're going to call categories list controller dot on category selected to, then we'll pass in the value of null. So in this case, when you click the logo, we want to just clear that out. So we'll hop into the browser, and you can see that when we click a category, that it is maintaining its state. So now what we want to do is set it up so that when we click on a category, we filter the bookmarks. So the first thing we need to do is go into the bookmarks controller, and we're going to inject the categories model. From there, we'll store a local reference. And then we're going to create a local reference called getCurrentCategory to the reference or to the getCurrentCategory method on the categories model. And so this is simply a pass-through property. But now what we're going to do is then add in a filter, and we're going to filter on the category property, and we're going to compare that against the current category name. So the idea is that when this filter runs, it's going to call bookmarks list controller get current category, which is really going to call get current category on the model. So we're going to click this, and you'll notice that nothing is happening. So let's see what is going on here. So we'll hop into the current category, or rather the category model, and let's just trace out what this is within this particular method. Refresh, and you can see here that we have categories model. So we have 4 of these, 4 on the left-hand side. But then we have this equals bookmarks controller, which is obviously not what we want to happen. And the reason why that's happening is because we're overriding the lexical reference to this. And so what we need to do is bind the getCurrentCategory method back to the categories model. And so just by adding .bind this categories model, now we're saying call this method, but call it within the context of categories model. So you can see here when we click this that the filter is now working. And if we look in the console, it's categories model all the way down. So let's just review what we've done up to this point. So in categories model, we've created a mechanism to set the current category and then retrieve the current category. And then from there, within the categories controller, we are setting the current category, but we're also testing for the current category as well so that we can apply an active filter. And then in the bookmarks controller, we're setting this current category to the getCurrentCategory on the categories model, which gets called by the filter. But then we had to add in the .bind to keep the reference to categories model correct. And this is how you bind to a model in an Angular 1 application. Managing state is one of the hardest things to do in any application. Angular 2 tackles this problem head-on by making it easy to implement a reactive unidirectional data flow that favors immutable operations. We're definitely moving in the right direction in Angular 1 by moving our state and logic to models, but invariably the question comes up, if we're moving to an immutable world, how do we manage mutable operations like forms in Angular? Mutable state in itself is not a bad thing as long as you're explicit about the boundaries around it. It is shared mutable state that is the devil's playground. In this lesson, we're going to see a surprisingly simple technique to isolate state mutations within a component. Now to get started, I've updated the bookmarks model to simulate CRUD functionality. We've imported a few methods from Lodash, and then I've added create, update, and delete methods to simulate the backend. Definitely not something I would put into production, but for the case of illustrations, this will work. I've also started to build out the save bookmark component, and the first thing to look at here is the save bookmark component itself, paying attention to the bindings that I've defined. So we have a bookmark input, and a save and cancel output. So we're passing in a bookmark that we're going to edit, and then when we're ready to save, we'll basically emit that event, or if we cancel, we'll just cancel that operation. So in the template, you can see here that the form is binding to the bookmark object on our save bookmark controller via the title and the URL. And then when a user clicks cancel, then we emit the cancel event. And when they click submit or hit enter, then we're emitting the save event, and we're just sending the bookmark back up to the bookmark controller for processing. And then within the bookmark controller, we're creating a local reference to the delete bookmark method. And then we have a reset method that is resetting the current bookmark to null. And so current bookmark is essentially the placeholder that we're using to keep track of the bookmark that we're editing. Now, if it's a new bookmark, then we're calling this init bookmark method, and we're just returning a pristine new bookmark object that's just keeping track of the category that you're currently in. And so within our bookmarks HTML, I am going to add ng-click, and we'll go ahead and call delete bookmark on the delete button. And we'll pass in the bookmark. And then within the edit button, we're going to call ng-click again, and we'll just call the edit bookmark method, and we'll pass in the bookmark that we want to edit. Now just below that, you'll see that we have a div that contains a button. So we're not going to show that if we're not currently on a category. But if we are on a category and there is not a current bookmark, when we click it, we're going to call bookmarks list controller create bookmark, and then we're going to put it into create mode. So what we have here is create bookmark. It just initializes the new bookmark. Edit bookmark sets current bookmark to the bookmark we pass in. And then from there, when we emit the save event, then it'll call save bookmark. And if there's an ID, then it'll update the bookmark. If not, it will create the bookmark. So this is kind of a simulated upsert pattern here. And then once it's been saved, then we reset and we go from there. So now we're going to add in the save bookmark component and wire this up. So we'll add the save bookmark component to the DOM, and we're going to toggle the visibility here. So first and foremost, we're only going to show this component if there is a current bookmark. And then from here, we're going to pass in the bookmark that we want to edit. And then let's hook up our output. So we'll go save, and when save is emitted, we'll call on save and pass back the bookmark object. And then on cancel, we're just going to call reset. And that's just going to set current bookmark to null. Now let's hop into the browser and check this out. So now you can see that when we're on a category, we can click create bookmark and create a bookmark. Now then, if we click the edit icon, it's passing that bookmark in and we can edit it. The problem is, you can see as I typed in the title, is it immediately updated it in not only the form, but in the bookmarks list as well. And if I canceled it, there's no way to back out of that. And so this is the problem of shared mutable state. How do we isolate that mutable operation so that we can back out of it, or that change does not affect other places in the application? So the problem is that this form is bound directly to the bookmark object, and we need to work around that. And so the way that we're going to do that is we're going to create a save bookmark controller. And then from here, we're going to define our save bookmark controller class. And then we're just going to hook into the on changes event hook. And so let's just log this out real quick. So when this event is fired, we're just going to log out on change fired. And then let's hook this into our component. And then we'll add this to the configuration object here. And let's refresh the page. And now let's clear this, and we'll now select a bookmark to edit. And you can see here that when we are updating current bookmark, that we're firing the console log. And so this is a close approximation to a unidirectional data flow in Angular 1, that in one-way data binding, that when we change the object, we're firing this on changes event. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new property called edited bookmark, and we're just going to use object.assign to return a new object that's a clone of the bookmark object. So we'll update the form now to set the mutations on edited bookmark, leaving the bookmark that we sent in intact. So we're just creating a local copy. So now if I go here and I update this bookmark to point to the new Angular.io site, you can see here that it's not updating, but when I save it, we're passing that up and it is working. And so you can see here that I can create something and I can cancel out no harm, no foul. But if I want to update it, because I'm editing the edited bookmark local object, then it's basically isolated to that component, and then it's only updated when we send it back. And so this is how you isolate state mutations within a component. You create a local object using object.assign, perform the mutable operations on that, and if you want to cancel, you throw it away, or if you want to persist it, then you emit it back up to the parent or smart component. In Angular 2, we use observables to push new data to our components. In Angular 1, we occasionally need to notify a component that a collection is changed so that we can perform an operation at the component level. For example, when we are editing or creating a bookmark, if we navigate to a new category mid-stride, we're left in this awkward state of an incomplete edit that is not congruent with the view that we are looking at. And so what needs to happen is we need to be notified when a new category is selected at the bookmark level so that we can reset the current bookmark. Even though we do not have the convenience of an observable to admit state changes to us, we can still spin up our own event bus to let us know when we need to hit reset. We're going to hop into the categories model and inject root scope. Now, just a bit of cautionary advice: be very judicious about what you put on root scope. It is not a global grab bag of properties, but it works very well as an event bus, as all events come from the scope object, and root scope being the mothership of them all. So within our set current category method, when we have set a new category, we're going to call this root scope broadcast, and we're just going to emit an event called on current category updated. And then from here, let's hop into the bookmark controller. We're going to inject scope, and we're going to listen for that event. And so root scope is broadcasting the event, and so it goes from the root scope component all the way down to all the children components. So we're guaranteed using broadcast on root scope that every scope object is going to hear or be notified of that event. And so we can go this scope on current category updated. Now we're going to call this reset, but we need to bind this method to the bookmarks controller itself, because we will lose that if we do not add bind this. Now let's hop into the browser, and now you can see that if we're in a create or edit state, that when we select a new component or a new category, it is reset. And so using the root scope broadcast in our model, we can notify our bookmarks controller that a category was selected, and then allow the bookmarks controller to perform its logic at the component level. And so this is how you notify your components that a collection is changed at the model. In this lesson, we are going to learn how to test a component using the component controller mock that ships with ngMocks. But first, let's take a quick moment and talk about how testing works with Webpack and ES6. Because we have to transpile our test just like our application, we need to tell Webpack how to do that. So we've created this spec bundle to convey to Webpack that these are the modules that we want to import, and this is how to do it. So we're importing Angular from Angular, mocks from Angular mocks, and then we're defining a context for our test, and then we're using that to bundle those up. And then if we go into the Karma configuration file, you can see that we have Karma Webpack, and we're passing in our bundle to be basically pre-processed before it goes to Karma. And so from here, let's look at our category spec, and we have a categories module, controller, component template with some very simple tests. So we're just testing the name of the module, that our categories contains a category item, and that our component has template, controller as controller equals the categories controller. So there's not a lot to test here, but we are going to take this a step further and show how to test the actual component controller. So let's initialize some variables here: component, component controller, and categories model. And then from here, let's go ahead and do some additional initialization. Because we're testing a component, we need to import the categories module, and then we are going to mock out the categories model. So we're just going to do $provide value categories model, and then we're going to simulate, or rather mock out, the get categories method and simulate a kind of a fake promise. So it's just an object with a then method on that. And then from here, just in another before each block, I like to break these out, we are going to assign, or rather inject, the component controller and the categories model using this underscore kind of wrapper here, and then assign those to our local variables. So categories model equals the underscore categories model, and component controller equals underscore component controller. And then from here, let's describe our test block for the controller. And so our test is that when the component is created, that the component controller calls categories model.getCategories immediately. And this is going to be a bit of a funny test, as you'll see in just a moment. So the first thing we need to do is create a spy on getCategories on categories model, and we're just going to call through. From here, let's initialize our component using component controller. So it'll take our component name, which is categories, and then its dependencies. In this case, it's just categories model. And then from here, let's write our assertion. So we expect categories model get categories to have been called. Now let's hop into the command line. We will run our test, and let's see what happens. Oh no. So the caveat here is that because we're not actually adding it to the DOM, some of the lifecycle hooks will not fire. So a little bit of hand waving, and we manually have to call this. So component on init, and let's run this one more time, and it should be green, yes, all the way down. And so this is how you test a component using the component controller.